Morning. Today I'm introducing my 2014 bonding proposal that would invest $986 million in projects statewide, creating more than 27,000 Minnesota jobs. This jobs bill would address many of our state's critical infrastructure needs while strengthening our economy and getting more people back to work. Let me just touch on a couple of the highlights. Once again, I've made proposals for downtown improvement projects in several of our most significant cities, and I again am proposing investments in the Rochester Mayo Civic Center expansion, in downtown Minneapolis and Nicollet Mall revitalization, the Mankato Civic Center, the Children's Museum and the Historic Palace Theater renovation in downtown St. Paul, the St. Cloud River's Edge Convention Center, and in Duluth, the renovation of the North Shore Theater and improvements at Spirit Mountain. In the past 2 years, 2011 and 12, last year's bill is an exception to itself, but in those two previous bills, I was just frankly astonished that the majorities in the Minnesota Senate and House were unresponsive to the needs of downtown cities, especially in our major state and regional centers. I learned from my father and my uncles for years that downtown revitalizations are crucial to the city's economic vitality and also the surrounding region. And I just, one of the things probably more than anything that just totally mystified me about the response or the lack of response to my bonding proposals was the unwillingness to fund these important projects. We got mayors, nonpartisan, but every bit as much Republicans as Democrats who strongly support these projects, who have lobbied their legislators on both sides of the aisle, and I'm just very, very hopeful that they will legislature this year, and it's going to take a bipartisan vote in both the House and Senate to pass a bonding bill, that they will recognize the imperative that we make these improvements in our downtown regional centers. I'm also providing significant funding for the University of Minnesota and MnSCU, and I'll get back to it in a minute to the needs that still exist there. The capital restoration project, I'm proposing the remaining $126.3 million to complete that restoration process. It's obviously in a bill even of $1 billion, that's about 13% of the total amount. So it's in a bill where there's already enormous competition for the available resources. It's taken a significant dent, but I believe strongly that we ought to finish paying for the project up front now, so that the contractors and others can proceed with the assurance so that they'll be compensated and we can get this project underway and then completed for the benefit of Minnesotans today and future generations. I just would point out that in total we received almost $3 billion in bonding requests. I'd say about 90% of them were really good projects that were seriously to urgently needed throughout our state. According to the formula that we've used from the economics professor at George Mason University, another $2 billion of bonding would create another 50,000 jobs all over Minnesota. $467 million of the requests came from the University of Minnesota and MnSCU. About half of that was for basic maintenance and repair, the rest for new initiatives. We cannot have a world-class education system without first-rate facilities. And that's the tip of the iceberg and the structural incapacity we have right now in our bonding for projects that are urgently needed if we're going to keep pace with the growing needs of our society and provide the kind of quality of education experiences, quality of state parks and other public resources that Minnesotans depend upon, that they enjoy, and that we need to continue to make ourselves attractive to economic as well as social advances. And if I return in 2015, I will have some recommendations to make about how we can broaden that capacity separate from its current general obligation funding source and limitations. I'll save that for a future date. Mr. Scholder is in charge of the financing of it and using his usual urge for prudent restraint upon me, and mostly complied. So he can answer questions related to financing. If there are project questions, either I'll respond or my excellent policy person, Katie Sen, will take over. Questions on this subject? You have anything you want to add?
We can go through the PowerPoint if you want to.
Okay, you're going through the whole PowerPoint?
I'll do it real fast if you want.
Okay. Anybody want to go through the PowerPoint?
Hearing no, we can
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay.
That's fine.
Given the outcry for the PowerPoint, my name is Jim Scholter, and I'll do this quickly. $986 million in bonds. As you know, capital projects are in the nature bricks and mortar. The governor always talks about making these bricks and mortars kinds of projects, and we have specific authority to do just that in general obligation bonds and other types of investments. Total impact of the proposals that the governor is making today is $1.4 billion. That includes both the general obligation bonds that we're talking about as well as local matches, other financing sources from higher education institutions and other sources. So this is a significant set of recommendations and impact that's going ahead here. The approach is balanced, as you'll see in past years. Many of the kinds of priorities and types of projects that you've seen in his past recommendations are there. We'll go into the details of some of these things, but in terms of economic development, the governor listed some of the key ones, but also some of the critical state needs and key projects that really just need to address, including facilities for human services, corrections, and other places like asset preservation. The next slide just talks about the capital budget framework. We've talked about it for a little while, but just so you know, the materials that you'll receive in these large books will show you all of the capital projects that are in front of us, more than $2 billion of requests, along with $8.8 billion from local units of government. There are plenty of ideas for construction, and the challenge is to pick ones that are ripe, ones that have a lasting impact, and take the state in the direction that we need to go. The balance of where those projects are is shown in the chart to my right. There's also a graphic in your PowerPoint slide deck, as you'll see. There is geographic distribution. You'll find these projects in communities across the state in large and in small ways, whether it's small asset preservation dollars to go help a facility, your local armory, or in a large way to construct a new building. The priority areas are listed as well. You'll see that typically, and as in this recommendation, education is the lead area for investment. The vast majority of that is in higher education through the University of Minnesota and the MnSCU system. Economic development, making sure we have adequate infrastructure to support business development, whether it's clean water, or wastewater, or parks, other things are all in that area as well. So there's a number of different priorities. I think you'll see that they're in line and pretty consistent with what you've seen in the past. If there's one outlier, it's the capital. The state capital is something we started last year. We're going to continue and wrap up. So as you see, the state government line is unusually large, and that's really almost entirely due to the capital. There's some more detail in the subsequent pages, gives you just some of the key projects in each of those areas. But that gives you, I think, a taste for the much longer list of projects that you have now and all the materials that will be up on the MNB website after this press conference. Thank you.
I just qualify and say that the capital is an outlier from a fiscal management standpoint, but not from obviously a policy standpoint and a program that facility that obviously has been proven to be near and dear to the hearts of Minnesotans, given the overwhelming public support for what we're doing here. So, any other questions then on this particular subject?
Do you have a breakdown between new construction and repairs and renovations, that type of thing?
Well, I mentioned before with the University of Minnesota and MnSCU that about half of their $469 million of combined requests goes for HEPRO, they call it, the basic repairs and maintenance. The other half goes for new programs and initiatives. And I agree with Commissioner Scholter that we picked $986 million of projects that we are convinced are really right for Minnesota. But we had to say no to just as many projects that are just as right. Several of which have been in the bonding queue since I arrived in 2011. So this is the fourth bonding bill now, where some of them have been included and not supported. So it goes back again to the structural incapacity, which I alluded to and which we'll get into in years ahead. For 2014, we'll deal with the system as we have it, and we'll deal with the bonding constraints that imposes, as well as legislative predilections. And beyond that, though, I would now note the urgent need for us to increase our capacity, starting with the University of MnSCU, to make the investments necessary to fulfill our goal of having a world-class education systems.
It's not the structural incapacity, but in fact, the size of bonding bills has been more constrained by a lack of political will, particularly in the Republican Party, to go with larger bills. How do you overcome that impediment?
Well, I've done my best to be persuasive over especially the first 2 years, and particularly as it relates to the downtown economic development projects. And unfortunately, it was in most cases not successful for reasons, as I say, that really confound me. I mean, Republicans are business-oriented, and the chambers in these cities strongly support these projects. And everything I learned on my father's knee about business development and civic economic vitality underscore the need for downtown projects. The natural tendency of business and new developments to go out, outline areas, pick greenfield sites and the like. So unless you give serious attention to downtown improvements, you start getting blighted areas, and then you end up, I remember going with Governor Purpose to Detroit back in the 1980s, and you just had this concrete hole in the middle of the city with the Hudson store, huge store, shut down, and it was just like a concrete fortress with no people. And that made a lasting impression on me. So, in terms of the overall amount of the bill, there are constraints in terms of the capacity that's recommended. I don't know if it's in the 3% is in statute, no, but it's been a long-standing policy. Someday, if you want, not so many people here, anybody's interested, I'll give you the history of how it went from 1% to 3% overnight after Governor Purpich visited bonding agencies in New York, but that's a story for another day.
Hausman is proposing to use some measure of surplus cash as part of her bonding proposal, which is about the same size. She thinks like $200 million. Do you envision using any surplus cash toward the bonding bill? And what is the state's bonding capacity at this point?
Well, the bonding capacity is reflected in the last revenue forecast. I think it was probably the same, close to the same in last February. Has been for $775 million bonding bill. If we were to enact my $986 million, it would cost about $3 to $4 million of additional appropriated dollars to cover in this biennium, and then more than that in the next biennium and subsequent ones. So there's a cost to going higher. There's also, the rating agencies, in a sense of prudence, we're, about 35th among the states in bonded indebtedness per capita. So we're in the lower tier, which is where we want to be. But, the trade-off is then if you don't do projects, you don't put people to work.
What about using cash, though?
I've heard Representative Hausman, also Senator Stumpf will both express interest in that, and since they chair the two committees, they'll obviously get the full consideration. I don't. It's not included in my bill. We're waiting. I'll wait until the next budget forecast, the 28th of February, to make any decisions about what I will propose that we use any additional resources for. Whether that's the wisest use of the money available relative to all the other demands and needs, just have to remains to be seen. But given the interest in the legislature, it'll certainly be on the table.
Governor, do you anticipate some criticism about whether some of these projects meet a regional or statewide significance, specifically the theaters in Duluth and St. Paul, maybe the Nicollet Mall and the snowmaking system up at Spirit Mountain? Do you anticipate there being some questions about projects like that?
Well, I mean, to me, those are prime examples of projects that have regional significance and statewide significance. I say again, the vitality of our downtown cities, especially the regional major cities and Minneapolis and St. Paul, are just crucial to the well-being of this state economically. And I'll go back to the stadium. You know, people who think that the stadium is not going to produce enormous economic returns for the city of Minneapolis and the state of Minnesota for years to come, long after I'm gone, are just dead wrong. And they will be proven so. In the Ryan development, $400 million private development, the first, or the largest private development, I'm told, in a generation in Minneapolis, is proof positive that this is going to have significant benefits that go beyond even what we are aware of today. But going back to your question, you know, the downtown Rochester. Rochester and Olmsted County send about $90 million more every year to the state treasury than they get back in local government aid, county aid, and school aid. Why wouldn't we want to do anything and everything we possibly could within reason to build the vitality of downtown Rochester? Now, the Destination Medical Center, which wouldn't have passed without my support, which wouldn't have passed without the excellent work of Tina Smith, who's selected by the board to chair the undertaking, it wouldn't have happened if with the attitude that, well, there's no role for the public sector in economic development projects, and they'd be going to some other state in the nation, and we'd lose that. This project, this proposal in the bonding bill preceded any discussions about the Destination Medical Center. So this was about revitalizing downtown Rochester in its present state, and well, given the leadership in the legislature in 2011 and 12, it was beyond my experience in state government that project in particular wasn't able to be funded by the legislature. But they're all mistakes on their part, serious mistakes in my view. Failures, once again, to recognize that there's a role for government in economic development. There's a role for government in creating jobs. And the track we've been on for the last 3 years, first with opposition and last session with significant support, has been to make those strategic investments, and they're paying off for Minnesota. They can see that already. They will continue to. And the people who want to just put government on the sideline and shrink it and just let the private sector go for itself don't even have supportive chambers of commerce in these areas, much less anybody who's got a broad or reasonable understanding of how economic development works in the real world, including the state of Minnesota.
Governor, so what can you do differently to get a different result out of the legislature? We've seen these projects year after year, Rochester, St. Cloud, Mankato, all those civic centers year after year. What can you do differently to finally get it out of the legislature?
You know, again, we'll mount the same public support, particularly in the communities that will benefit from it. Again, the civic leadership, the local government leadership will use every power of persuasion available. It's an election year. I mean, it's a bill where, because it requires Republican votes to pass in both bodies, it's going to be one of the bargaining chips, inevitably probably used at the very end. So that'll enter into it and complicate matters.
The election year aspect on getting votes.
I think it probably makes it more difficult, but not insurmountable. We had passed the bonding bill in 2012 and passed the stadium bill in 2012, and so it's doable. But you know, anyone has any suggestions for how to get these through? I have done my utmost for, especially 2011 and 12, to get these projects passed. As you note, they're back again. So it suggests we need a newer, better strategy, and I'm all ears.
Governor, you've been sharply critical of Republicans. You're going to need those votes to get any bonding bill passed. Have you reached out to them at all?
Oh, I have. 2011 and 12, we had morning breakfasts and other conversations, formal and informal, and you know, we had Republican leaders in those respective communities and mayors who were strongly supportive of them. So, you know, you'd have to ask them what the basis for their opposition. But I think more than anything, they've been caucus decisions. They've been driven by the extreme right wing of both of those two caucuses, which are against any government involvement. They would be against the Destination Medical Center. They would be against the stadium. They'd be against any of the projects that have involved the state's financial participation that are going to bring enormous economic benefits to those cities and to those areas of the state and to the entire state. And that's, you know, just a fundamental ideological difference that they have with myself and I think most people in the mainstream in Minnesota. I believe they hold to it sincerely. I just think they're wrong.
Extreme right wing aside, have you talked to them about this bonding proposal?
I have not talked to anybody about this bonding bill. I'm just putting it out today, and we'll have conversations from this point on. This is the beginning of the process, one that will take at least the next 2 months before the legislature arrives, or about 6 weeks now, and then go on for however long they're in session. So we're talking about the beginning of a process that'll take a few months, and you know we'll have all those discussions, and certainly with the Republican leadership as well as the DFL, and hope that we can get some independent thinking in those two caucuses.
Your decision not to include the Lake Vermillion Park, so does that mean you wouldn't support it if it came to you? It's a dear project to the Senate leader, of course.
From the very beginning of 2011, and the majority leader understands, because my family owns property on Lake Vermillion, even though it's on the other side of the lake, I've recused myself from any bonding decisions, any financial decisions, any programmatic decisions. Those all reside with, in terms of the program and policy, with Commissioner Landwehr, and in this case, I don't make any proposal. I'm not against it. I would sign a bill that had it and have it before in 11 and 12, but I'm not taking a position on it.
Governor, I see there's no mention of Southwest Light Rail in here. Could you talk about that?
Well, part of it is just a basic financial consideration. Another $125 million project is just not feasible given the limits of this bill. And given the status of it right now and the fact that those issues haven't been resolved, and the reality that if we're going to have any kind of real public transit initiatives in this larger region and elsewhere in the state, we're going to have to come up with, a funding source that's not going to be dependent on the traditional general obligation state bonding. The cost of these projects is just prohibitive unless you want to start excluding, you know, $125 million of very worthwhile projects elsewhere in the state. So I made a proposal last year for a metro sales tax, a half cent, that would fund the Southwest Rail and other existing and then future public transit projects, and I don't know that the legislature has any willingness to take that on this year, particularly given the stalemate right now that exists with the Southwest Light Rail. We'll see how it unfolds in the next few months. I'd be supportive of it, but I think it's probably more likely it's going to be something that will be taken up seriously in 2015.
Governor, advocates for the homeless have come up with a really large request. I see you funded about half of that. It's a bigger coalition than we've ever seen before around that issue. What were your considerations as you made that proposal for $50 million?
Well, I funded a third of the total requests that came in, and as I said, most of them are all serious. Most of them, many of them urgent. That certainly isn't urgent. The Housing Finance funded more than recommended more funding there than I have in any of the bills heretofore, and wish could do more and recognize the need for more. And well, again, we're going to, I'll support any initiative that can increase that amount.
Have you included any projects specifically to get Republican votes?
No, I've included every project here because I thought they were vitally important for Minnesota, and I turned down many more, and I never asked anybody whose legislative district a project was in. Some of them I know because I've been here a while, but I didn't ever look at that issue.
Commissioner, is it prudent to exceed the general fund debt limit? Bond rating agencies are going to look askance.
To your question, it's really two different measures. What the governor was referring to was what's in the forecast, how much we anticipate in our current projection of expenditures to be going for debt service. Our debt guidelines are published with each forecast, and those show significant room that can more than accommodate the proposal that the governor is recommending. There's a couple of different guidelines, and the amount of space that we have in those guidelines is measured in billions.
So for the record, that's the commissioner of MMB saying that there's opportunity to spend significantly more money on behalf of important public projects.
You have to pay it back.
Commissioner, on average, how much would it cost per year to repay the bonds in 20 years?
The incremental amount, I'm not sure. We'll get that for you.
I remember the stadium numbers, about $1 billion in bonding is like $1.6 billion, but that's a guess, but over the 20 years.
How much do we currently roll in fuel bonds?
There's a website quiz. I'll look on the website while we take the next question.
I don't see high-speed rail projects on the list either, like Zip Rail from Rochester to Twin Cities. Can you talk a little bit about your decision not to include those?
Well, I gave a high priority to projects that are ready to go, that are ready to involve actual construction. That means that the public support some of the the wrinkles there, the opposition has been worked out, and location decisions are made. There are some out of necessity that include planning and architectural design and engineering, although I'm still go back to my for earlier years here where I mean bonding those costs were paid for out of general operating revenues, state or the entity, and then the bonding bill was really focused on construction, which is what I think it should be, given the cost of these architectural and engineering designs and all. By the time I arrived here, a lot of that had been incorporated into it, and you can debate that either way, but that was basically accepted practice. But I did say I want projects that, after that part of it is done, are ready to go ahead to be funded fully. And in this case with high-speed rail, I'm a big advocate of high-speed rail, and I mean real high-speed rail, the kind I've experienced in China and Western Europe. And in particular, I've said, I think a tremendous project would be a truly high-speed rail line, talking 180 to 230 miles an hour, which is the current technological capacity in China and elsewhere. Going from the Rochester airport to downtown Rochester in front of the Mayo to the airport here, and then I'll let Minneapolis and St. Paul decide where it goes next. But, that's a multi-billion-dollar project, and I don't see the resources at the federal level, given the financial condition of the federal government and the lack of really visionary view of what public investment in the rail and public transit area needs to be. I just don't see anybody who can say that beyond paying for the design architectural work and the engineering studies that they're anywhere near ready to go. And if you wait a decade or whatever, till the money came for the construction, you have to redo a lot of those initial designs anyway.
Governor, why don't you pick the Tate Science Building? The university had a pretty long laundry list of requests, and you picked the Tate Science Building as the biggest project. Why was that your priority?
I believe it wasn't the top one of their, HEPRO was their top one.
HEPRO was their top priority, and the Tate was number 2. And they actually had 5 projects, and you funded 4 of them. So.
Including the Wellness Center in Crookston, because I thought that...
And the research laboratory improvement.
We had a lengthy discussion about the need to improve conditions for the bees, and who else was it? But the humans who work in those areas and who teach young people who want to work in those areas were the kind of the swing factor in the decision.
So there is money in here for bees and cup?
That's what on me. There's money here to improve the facilities to do research on bees, and on their habitat and on their survival.
Is this a case of you shooting high, knowing that the climate is probably going to call for subtraction to get a bill passed?
Well, I've seen legislative suggestions for over $1 billion. I think I've seen legislative suggestions for keeping the 2 years, last year and this year, at just under $1 billion, which would mean what was last year? 156 million. How much was the total bonding bill last year? Last spring? 154. So we're talking about, what, 850. But even that's, in the ballpark. I mean, my previous experience, my proposals come out shrunken and without the same specifics. So I don't expect the bill's going to go higher than that, and then we'll see how much lower. But again, I just go back to the almost 3 to 1 the number of dollars of bonding requests for what my proposal is able to to fund. And just if anybody looks at the needs around the state, looks at these projects that were not included in my bill, you realize, how much is lacking by failure to do so.
One of the late entries into the request is the Dorothy Day homeless shelter. Did you consider that at all?
I did, and I've been there to see their overnight overflow. I've served a couple Thanksgiving lunches there. I mean, it's a fabulous program, and the work. It's, as you said, it's a late entry, and there's still issues unresolved about the location being proposed, and there's debate among, as from what I read and see, debate among local officials who represent that area and citizens group and the like. The mayor, Mayor Coleman, and Mr. Pat Marks, the director of Dorothy Day, came to see me, a couple of others. I think it was probably early November, and made a very strong case for it programmatically. As it's certainly something that's needed. But again, my top priority were projects that were pretty much worked out the public issues and the other financing issues, so they'd be ready to go. And that's one that, with probably 4 months left until the end of the session, if they can resolve some of those issues clearly and have the rest of the money clearly identified, then we'll see what happens at the outcome.
Governor, a project that's been a favorite of the House bonding chair is the idea for a new Bell Museum for Natural History. What's your view of that project?
Well, I go mostly, not entirely, but mostly with the MnSCU and University of Minnesota own list of priorities, because they're closest to the situations. The Bell Museum, what was it, 19th on the?
They didn't have it on their list.
Was on their list. How many projects do they have total?
They had 5 projects.
Okay, I thought there were more.
At University of Minnesota.
Yeah, okay. Well, it wasn't on it. I've heard informal review that's lower than that in their priorities. Not to say it's not a worthwhile project, but it's just not, it's competing with these other projects that are, the university considers more imperative. And given the, strong views of the chair of the House Bonding Committee, it'll certainly, be on the table throughout the process. So I'm not opposed to it, but I do think there are higher priorities.
Did you recommend funding for a fence around the Shakopee Women's Prison?
Yes. I put the money in. I put the money in last year. It's for the fence to surround it and provide the kind of additional security that residents need and that Commissioner of Corrections very much wants to provide. And also, I'll make a special plug also or appeal for the St. Peter facility, which again is in my proposal for the 4th year. And given the challenges we face there, ones that the legislature and I are going to have to deal with, that upgrade of that facility, you walk through there and I mean it's hard to believe that anything sufficiently therapeutic can occur in a very obsolete environment with unpadded walls, with sight lines for the professional staff, obstructed views that allow things to go on that shouldn't there. I mean, it's just in crying need of these improvements and actually more, but this is an expensive request, but it's, I think, a crucial one. The other downtown improvement project, I really should include this, is one in southwestern Minnesota, the Lewis and Clark water system, which the federal government got started and is now totally abandoned and is not likely to come back to in any significant way. And as a result, the towns of Laverne and Worthington have both had to constrain their future economic growth, say no to new manufacturing projects and additional jobs because of the lack of sufficient water. And so this, my proposal here would take it to the next phase, state-funded, recognizing the federal government is almost certainly not going to come through again, and take it to Laverne, and then the next phase, which I would certainly support if I were back to do so, and the next round would be to take it to Worthington and take it to the Iowa border, and then say, now it's up to you.
Dayton, Governor, was a $1 billion bonding bill, would you still, if you were reelected, recommend another bonding bill next year?
Probably, yes.
You want one every year?
Well, I mean, there have been bills in every year more often than not in the last 20 years since repurpose discovered that's the story for another day. But they, it's become commonplace. And unfortunately, in 2011, it was obviously bipartisan support there. It was Republican majorities in the House and Senate. And to their credit, they recognized that with extremely low interest rates and with unemployment as severe as it was throughout the state, especially in the building trades, that was really those are really important projects, and I appreciate the support they provided there. Again, it wasn't as much as I would have wished for, but it was something. And then last spring, various considerations derailed a full-scale funding bill, but we did provide the money to get the capital renovations started and a few other things. So I don't think it's not without precedent to have a annual bill. And if I'm back, I mean, I would reserve final judgment until I looked at the various economic conditions. And as I say, I look at how we could address this. Well, I thought up until now this chronic shortage of resources, but I'm going to pursue Commissioner Schroeder's invitation to look at the existing capacity.
Any other questions on this topic?
You give me the signal then, yeah. That was good, that was good. Anything else on this bill? Anything else?
Governor, you mentioned that the Southwest Light Rail project, you referred to its status, and obviously the planning has been on hold for a few months now. Does the exclusion of this in your bill suggest that your support for the project is wavering? And how much in trouble do you think the project is?
No, I proposed last year. It was not in my bill last year, and the cost of it, 125 million, and it could be more than that, 150, 160 million. It really is. I mean, the cost of these projects is again eclipsed the capacity within our previously used general obligation bonds for these projects, which is why I proposed last session the half-cent metro sales tax increase that would could completely fund the completion of the Southwest Light Rail line, and then other projects now on the boards for the rest of the metro area buses and beginning of some light rail projects, and then would have a continuing funding source to really advance those projects. We for years have suffered from doing these piecemeal, and we get some federal money, we combine it with some state money, and we do that piece, and then we try to do another piece, and we do another piece, and then we don't have enough money for the pieces that we need. So, for example, the North Star train stops 12 miles short of the largest population center in the entire region, St. Cloud, which if you want to drive down ridership, you couldn't think of a worse way to do so than that. It resulted in the Central Corridor being rammed down the throats of the Board of Regents of the University of Minnesota and the administration, who are constitutionally charged with the decision-making authority about what's in the best interest of the university and what's not. And once again, it's like, well, we don't have enough money, and the feds, can only do this much, and I don't know that anybody ever went back to the federal government and pressed that point. I was not in the Senate then, but when I was in the Senate, the senators, I suppose the congressmen and women from Mississippi, got $2 billion inserted into a transportation bill to reroute a whole rail line across the entire width of the state of Mississippi. So I know what's possible. Now against the earmarks and all those things, and so there are other constraints. But the fact is, the resources are potentially available. You just got to go out and work really hard to get them, and you have to have the capacity within the state. So when there is an opportunity, if there is a piece of money, if somebody a couple of years ago returned, was it Florida, I believe it was, returned money because they'd been granted by the federal government, and suddenly that was available, you have to have the internal capacity then to say, hey, we can, if you give us this amount of money, we have the state funding and the local funding already in place to proceed. So a long-winded way of saying it's not in there. I think we've got a better and necessary alternative way to fund it into the future. Okay. You're welcome to stay around for this.
Rick, we can take questions.
I'm just going to say, I'd like to restate what I wrote yesterday. And to answer a couple questions that have come up. Lieutenant Governor established yesterday as the day she wanted to make her press announcement, and on Wednesday last week I got not only invited to the National Governors Association Executive Committee meeting with the President and the Vice President, but also called by David Agnew, the Deputy Chief of Staff, the White House for Intergovernmental Relations, and asked to go so they could have an even balance. There were 3 Republican governors, 3 Democratic governors. So that's where I went yesterday and concluded my participation. And Lieutenant Governor did a magnificent job of handling that situation and responding to questions and the like. And I really have nothing else that I could add to what she said. And I'd just like to restate for the record my remarks yesterday that were published that throughout her 25 years of devoted public service as Duluth City Council member and Council President, State Senator, and Lieutenant Governor, Yvonne Pretner-Solon has been a courageous champion for the people of Minnesota. Lieutenant Governor Pretner-Solon's tireless leadership on behalf of Minnesota's senior citizens and people with disabilities has greatly improved many lives. She's been key to achieving our administration's primary mission, building a better Minnesota for all of our citizens. I thank Yvonne for her invaluable service to our state, and I pledge my continuing support for the important initiatives she has championed as Minnesota's Lieutenant Governor. Be glad to respond to questions. Let's cover this subject now, and then we'll see if there's anything else after.
Governor, who's on your short list of potential running mates?
Well, I'm not ready to discuss that at this point, but I'm certainly, now that this decision has been made and announced, involved actively in that consideration.
Did you try to dissuade the Lieutenant Governor from not running again? Did you want her to stay on the ticket?
Well, again, I don't really have anything to add to what she said yesterday, and I think she said that, I didn't ask her to leave, I didn't ask her to stay, basically up to her, and we had a discussion on Monday, and I had intimations beforehand that she's leaning in the direction of going back home, and that's the announcement she made.
So why didn't you ask her to stay if she was as great as you just said?
Again, I think she answered these questions superbly well yesterday. She's made enormous contributions to my administration, to the state of Minnesota throughout her years of public service. Been a tremendous leader and public servant, and I think that's where I'll leave it.
You have until June to fill this void. Do you intend to act much sooner? Or
much sooner.
Like how soon? What's your personal time?
Much sooner. Shortly.
As soon as you like one.
Shortly.
What's your process?
Shortly.
The Lieutenant Governor said yesterday she thought the role needed to be beefed up. Do you agree with that? And what would be some ideas for doing that?
Well, there was an excellent editorial in your paper this morning about and I agree with it, and I think she touched on this also, some of the structural deficiencies that really compound the problem of just finding a role and establishing that and proceeding. So I think those are excellent recommendations. There are a couple, and I will give those more thought before the session. One thing that's always come to my mind is the Lieutenant Governor's on the Executive Council. That meets first, 5 constitutional officers, and then Lieutenant Governor leaves, and the 4 remaining constitute the State Board of Investment. Well, the Lieutenant Governor is just as well qualified financial expertise in the previous couple of decades as anyone else on the board, and and also means we have now 4 members, which means you need a 3-to-1 vote to proceed anyway. So why not have the 5? And that's a very significant, very important responsibility. So those would be the kind of things I'd look for in terms of statute, and also then, I'm sure whoever I'm talking to about the positions is going to have, questions about what those responsibilities would be, and I'll have questions about what that person wants those responsibilities to be, and we'll work with what we have. But I think it's an important position. I think it could be made a more important position, and I'll do my best to see that happens.
Governor, what are you looking for in a lieutenant governor?
Well, the very best, somebody who's eminently well qualified to lead the state if there's something unforeseen happens to me. I think that should be any chief executive decision of any governor, obviously president. And then somebody who can really, go around the state, be active, is in a position to really travel the state, be the people's representative back here in St. Paul, but be a point of contact where people have a sense that they can express directly to their government what the problems are. You know, I give my home phone number out because I get many of my best ideas from people who are just calling directly that don't have to filter through the bureaucratic layers. The President said yesterday to governors, he didn't give out his home phone number, but you can call the main number and they'll route you. But you know, again, if there are problems, bring them directly to him or to his top people. You know, and I think any of us, well, he stressed, he said, I want government to work. Well, I want government to work, and I want it to work better. And I want a person who understands the structure of government, state government, local government, and the relationships there, and you know, agrees with me that government is vitally important, and that government can stand a considerable improvement, and we will do everything we can if I have 4 more years to achieve those goals.
How important would geography and gender?
Does geography matter that is balance or politics? Well, it's certainly a consideration. It's historically been a consideration. I consider myself governor for all of Minnesota. I've traveled this state more miles in the last 35 years than anybody else in public life in Minnesota. I'm quite certain of that. In recent years, 87 counties in 87 days and other initiatives. I mean, you know, anybody can only be from one place. So I'm from Minneapolis, now it's temporarily St. Paul, and Lieutenant Governor's from Duluth, but that means there's nobody from southwestern Minnesota or southeastern. I mean, you can only be from one area, but you're not elected governor or lieutenant governor from Minneapolis or from Duluth. You're elected governor of Minnesota and lieutenant governor of Minnesota. And your responsibility is statewide. And that's why, again, I say I want a lieutenant governor who's, in terms of his or her personal life situation and inclination, is willing to be on the road, travel a lot, and really spearhead that outreach, bring agency heads along with her or him when that is necessary, but really engage people where they live.
Gender as well as geography, is that a factor? It's become almost a tradition.
It has. I mean, I think it's an important statement, a very important statement. I mean, my running mates have been, and proposed running mates have been women. I thought that was important at the time to show that respect and that balance. And my senior staff has here been, I started out with what I called the Magnificent Seven, and they were all women. And then a couple of men have gotten into the senior ranks and diluted the caliber. You know.
Likely to choose a woman, is that fair to say?
I just said it's an important consideration. And for the record, Bob Hume is superb.
Hey, Governor, we're running up on your next time, so we got time for a few more questions.
Yeah. Governor, have you talked to anyone yet, or have you?
I've talked informally to a couple of people, but now I'll enter a stage of more formal discussions.
When you announced Yvonne Sullivan as your running mate, I recall you saying she would be different and more involved in your administration. She has said in the past, again yesterday, that she thought she would be more involved in policy initiatives. Did you lead her on, and would your next pick be different?
I didn't lead her on, certainly. You know, I mean, I don't know how to reconstruct the last 3 years, and you know, whatever happened didn't happen. She expressed her disappointment. It didn't turn out the way she had hoped, and I disappointed it didn't turn out the way I hoped and the way we both hoped. And again, I think a lot of that was well captured in the editorial today as being, you know, structural. And I also pointed out, and when we met on Monday, you know, the first 6 months here were the Republican majorities in the legislature, and they came in, and to their credit, they came in the first day of the session in beginning of January, and they had a full agenda, and they were full force, and we were late in getting finally, you know, the election resolved, and then therefore late in hiring agency heads, and then late in getting any of our own policy initiatives prepared and put into legislation. So we were, you know, this is a very, much more chaotic operation internally, and probably in terms of external interactions than it certainly is now, and really was after that point in time. And I think that left everybody out in limbo.
Elsewhere in the Capitol Senate Committee is talking about that controversial Senate office building. Is that becoming an election year liability? And what do you view as the future of that building? Is it going to get built?
Well, I've supported the need for a Senate office building and to relieve the pressures on the state office building, which I see some people now disavowing for what I think are political campaign reasons. If we're going to do this right, and we're going to, in my view, get most legislators out of here and into suitable offices in either the state office building or another building, that needs to go on at the same time as this project. But yes, I mean, it's certainly become partisan and political and campaign oriented, and I've had informal conversations with both Majority Leader Bach and Speaker Thiessen, and without reaching any conclusions, but expressing my concerns about the overall cost. And we've had the Department of Administration now do scenarios that would reduce the cost $10, $20, $30 million a piece. That's not going to satisfy people who are now opposed to it, including people who I understood from Senator Bach he thought were agreeable to a bipartisan approach. But that's evidently fallen apart, and so we'll have to deal with it now as the situation as it is. And that means very partisan, very political. And I haven't had a chance again to talk with the Speaker or the Majority Leader about the new reality, but certainly will in the very near future.
Governor, you suggested earlier this week, and not to change the subject, I apologize before you go, but that you'd be open to signing a medical marijuana bill, possibly after a state-sponsored study of how it's been perceived and handled in other states. I'm curious why the change of heart, and why in the past did you give a priority towards law enforcement over the medical community and patients?
Well, first question, you know, as I've been engaged with people on both sides of this question, and I really, you know, respect the sincerity of people on both for and against legalization of marijuana for medical uses. I realize there's just, at least for me, so many unanswered questions that really have a bearing on how many people are we talking about? How many people, you know, can only get the medical benefits that they need from using marijuana versus all the other pharmacological options that are legal and can be prescribed? What's the cost of setting up these different distribution centers, one in every county, and then a network for, you know, the growing and the control and the sale? How can they, you know, very valid concerns of law enforcement that, and the experiences of other states that have seen a wide proliferation of use of marijuana in the general public, even with the limitation on medical. California, I mean, I have friends who live in California, and you just find anybody in the neighborhood who, you know, get a blank medical thing and sign it and get yourself a stash. So I mean, so the cost and benefit part of it, as well as what are the experiences of other states? We're, you know, 21 states now that have adopted this. Where has it gone wrong? Where has it gone right? What are the key factors in it being going right or not? Is it possible to address through those experiences the primary concerns of law enforcement, that we already have a, you know, drug epidemic in this state in so many ways, and they got to deal with it, both in terms of the trafficking of it, the sale of it, and the people who come into the state to sell this stuff. I mean, you know, we got gangs in small Minnesota communities from, I'm told, from Mexico, from Los Angeles, who are armed to the hilt with